The Manufacturing Edge, where ops leaders break barriers, drive growth, and redefine what's possible.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of The Manufacturing Edge. My name is Will Merriman, and I'm filling in today for our Managing Director of Business Development, Daniel Bobick. Very excited to get into this week's episode with David Pate and Brian Cromer, two of our resident experienced consultants here at TBM. We're going to be diving into a topic that's top of mind for a lot of domestic manufacturing leaders right now, and that is how to hit your AOP goals when budgets are tightening and certain pressures are constraining factors like the supply chain. With the rising global tariffs, we've seen supply chain disruptions and increased operational costs, and a lot of manufacturers are being asked to do more with less. So the question now is, how do you stay lean, stay focused, and still deliver results? As we get to the end of Q2 and the mid-year point, we should really start thinking about what leaders are putting into play as far as goals go and how that can affect the AOP going into Q3 and Q4. So let's get into it. I'll start off by introducing Brian. Brian's our leader of our supply chain practice. Brian, it's good to have you on the call. I have a question. Every manufacturer that's currently importing a piece or a part from somewhere, and with global tariffs rising, how do you think manufacturers can reassess their sourcing strategies to protect some of their margins and meet AOP targets?
Yeah, thank you, Will. Good morning to everybody. Let's start first with more of a higher level. So companies should start with a portfolio review. Look at the entire portfolio to see if there's potentially some items that could be deselected, but at least focus on the critical few versus the mass number of items that you may have. Once you determine what those critical items are, then start to look at different sourcing options. So that could be getting creative on how do I navigate around tariffs by the way that I get product shipped from point A to point B. It could also be looking at alternate manufacturers or suppliers to be able to provide the same or similar products that would be in regions that would be at a less impact due to the recent tariffs, but more importantly, keep a longer term view to ensure that you have a process that you could consistently and repeatedly go back and look at risk in the supply chain. But getting those alternate supply sources is really critical to ensure that you're going to have a stable supply chain and be able to protect against your customers' satisfaction.
And following up with that, I think it's along the same lines of really diversifying supply chains and doing a full analysis. But what are some of the specific ways that companies can build more resilient supply relationships that support both their cost controls and also may have a positive impact on an annual operating plan?
Right. The first key is to build a strong relationship with your suppliers. Oftentimes you have suppliers that you found, but it's really not a good working relationship. We find often that as businesses, we believe the suppliers should do what we ask them to do without any question, without any additional input. But if you build a relationship where both parties could win and start to determine what are the best options together, then working as a team is way more successful. And that takes a look at all the costs related to getting product sourced into your manufacturing facilities or distribution networks. So you have to take into account the supplier costs, the freight cost, any of the tariff impacts. And the one that oftentimes gets forgot is the cost to carry inventory. So the longer the lead time to get the product to you, the more inventory that you need to carry to mitigate risk. And ultimately, you've got a lot of cash tied up.
To follow up on that, you talked about the increasing costs of inventory. Is that something we're seeing more so with companies that may have large swaths of inventory say, nearshored in the U.S., or is that more of a global trend?
Yeah, it's twofold. You've constantly seen a lot of companies trying to resource from near shore to be able to reduce some of those inventory levels. Freeing up cash gives the advantage to be able to invest into the business, ultimately getting more cost reduction opportunities. And then now with the recent tariff impact, it's becoming even more critical to take a look at, how do I avoid some of the costs due to the tariffs, but also be able to start reducing my inventory down. And with all of these considerations, you have to ensure that we don't jeopardize the customer. At the end of the day, the customer is what keeps businesses floating and in business. So it's important to keep that mindset of how do I satisfy the customer at all points.
Hey, Will, I'd like to pile on to something Brian said around this idea of supplier relationships. I just think back to my professional career prior to being in consulting. The company that I worked for, this goes back to the late 80s, Toyota was one of our customers, and then they came and did supplier development. And it was different than, I would say, others that, they would come and figure how they could get cost reductions. They helped create an improved process, which then netted cost reductions rather than take the cost reductions and leave you to figure it out. So that idea of partnership is, I think, even more important today as the supply chains have become less stable. Having stronger supplier partnerships, and sometimes that may mean your suppliers may not be as well performing as your company. In some cases, they may be better. I can think of examples. Obviously, I mentioned Toyota that helped us in supplier development, but then in a safety context, one of our suppliers, DuPont, helped us. So it can work both ways, and I think that's something that leadership teams have to think about. And it can be a really small investment. And from your company's standpoint, we've helped many companies do supplier development as well. Just where there's opportunities, how do you help those suppliers get at those opportunities, and then you will also benefit.
Yeah, and it seems too it's not just a one track. Let's look at something like cost with a supplier, but let's actually dig into every single factor that a supplier might have in our business and see how we can optimize it. So kind of planting that supplier feed and looking at it from a holistic perspective seems to be important. But let's move into a couple questions on supply chain management. David, thank you for hopping in there. Brian, back to you on supply chain management. What would you say are some practical steps that manufacturers can take to reduce supply chain costs without compromising delivery performance?
Yeah, so I'll go back to the first statement. Start with the portfolio. Understand, where you should invest inventory into the business, which products or items that you need to ensure that you always have available. So really understand that portfolio, but make sure that you have a process that this becomes a routine exercise. Many times we go through the exercise once and we believe, okay, we're done. You got to keep up and stay on top of it. So make sure that you have the right process put into place to be able to track and look at that. Once you know what the portfolio looks like and what you need to focus on, then you leverage some technologies. There's a lot of good technology out in the market today that can help to predict when risk would arise. Those could be things like the recent tariffs. It could be changes in the way that different countries are interacting with each other. But find the right technologies and try to figure out which ones are going to best work for your business to be able to understand what potential risk might be coming before they arise. The other thing is really understand your quality position. So keep an eye out on your quality coming from your supply source, because one of the biggest costs that gets incurred that are often overlooked is the cost of poor quality. If you have a long lead time item coming to you and you realize that all of a sudden we have a quality concern, then the time in order to get product replenished can really jeopardize and hurt the way that we're able to deliver to the customer and impact the entire supply chain. And on top of being costly, it takes time to recover from some of those effects as well.
Yeah. Would you say, Brian, at least in your past couple months of working, have you seen people, leaders at manufacturing sites, looking at quality and technology as much as they should?
Not as much as they should. It's usually after the fact, right? So we have a large quality issue. We start air freighting product from overseas. We incur a lot of cost. And then people start to talk about, what can we do to make sure this doesn't happen again? The facts are there's always going to be disruptions. There's always going to be risks. So make sure you have the processes in place to be able to monitor effectively and efficiently, to be able to react quickly and make sure your supply chain is as nimble as it possibly can be. And that's one of the main goals of trying to nearshore or reshore, is it starts to reduce some of those risk factors.
And kind of along those lines, David, do you want to jump in and
Yeah, the thing, I think Brian's exactly right. There's always going to be supply chain risk, and the risks today are just a different risk than what we had and manufacturing companies, we spent a number of years with very low interest rates, and the thought process was that, hey, inventory's free. I'll just keep more inventory and that'll smooth out whatever supply chain risks that I have. That's not the case today. We went from just in time to too darn much, and we're paying the price now. So I think it's really important, as Brian says, you've got to create a robust supply chain through tools, partnerships, and processes that can allow you to be nimble. Companies are not nimble from a supply chain perspective are going to be in trouble.
And along those lines, with the high inventory costs, Brian, are you seeing any additional costs that firms are having to incur based on some of these updates in the market, aside from the high inventory costs?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the tariffs are one of the key concerns today. It's unknown as to how long it's going to stay, if there's going to be reductions coming in the future. So you have to take the stance and look at it as though we're always going to have something come up. So how do we manage that overall supply chain the best we can? Make sure your processes are in place, that you can ensure that you're constantly looking into it and constantly being able to adjust, which means you need that nimble supply chain. And as we know, a lot of companies don't have the ability to quickly react. So it's very costly.
Agility seems to be a key at the moment.
Absolutely, it is key.
To switch gears a little bit, I know we just got into the costs, but to discuss how those are being addressed, I'll come back to you, David. What are the most overlooked operational and human capital costs that you think manufacturers should be tracking more closely to stay on target within their annual operating plans?
Some of the ones that are often overlooked is we've already talked about inventory and how because of low interest rates that it was perceived as being free. It's no longer anymore. So that's certainly one. The cost to hire and train employees is also very high and very often underappreciated. Many companies have issues finding people, and then when they do find people, they'll churn those people in the first 30, 60, 90 days. But the cost to do that training and the cost to the process of not having trained people is not appreciated in many cases. And then, overall labor costs, material costs, those are things that, have forced companies to go offshore and now we're feeling the pinch because of tariffs. So you got to look back at those. Do I have the right labor complement for the processes that I have, and is there waste in that I can take that waste out and make my labor force more effective? Same goes for materials. The idea of value add, value engineering. How do I make products that are have less content of materials, but still satisfy the customers and perhaps do so even better? Those are things that we're working with companies with a lot in these times.
Yeah, and when considering that, it seems like you can take money and try to make a multitude of improvements, but there are focused things that are going to make the biggest change. How would you say that like balancing up rising costs and keeping a high quality standard can be done throughout an organization's operations?
Well, I think those things go hand in hand, Will. I mean, you've got to satisfy the customer expectations. Beyond having expectations beyond what your customer expects is a cost, but you've got to satisfy those customer expectations. And one of the key ways we do this takes waste out of the process, including process capability and repeatability. If I have a capable process and it's very repeatable, then I have standards in that process, and that process is functioning well. If I have a process that has a lot of variability, on the other hand, then I've got a lot of waste. I've got to have more material or labor content in it to cover up the fact that I have a lot of variability. And so to me, cost reduction and quality go hand in hand, because I can define quality by less variability and meeting those customer expectations. So managing those things is very, very important.
Yeah. And then at what point of that does maintenance come in? Because it seems like it's talked about as far as reducing costs and how you can get ahead of some machine problems. But where does maintenance excellence come in? How does that come into play with quality and some of the rising costs? And how can you implement it if a team might be on a tight budget?
Well, a automotive supplier and supplier of aftermarket parts, once had a jingle, a marketing sales jingle called, you can pay me now or you can pay me later, right? And it's very true. Very often companies will run to failure with the thought process of, I'm not spending on this equipment and then, I'll fix it. It's cheaper for me to fix it later. Well, that may be in your maintenance cost, but how much cost am I incurring in other issues, quality issues, productivity issues, and frankly, human capital issues, because people do not like to work with equipment that doesn't work. I mean, what does an operator want to do? They want to operate, right? So equipment that doesn't work and they have to stop, clean, fix, all those kind of things makes for not a very productive day, a high cost day. And I got an operator who's not happy, is probably looking to go somewhere else. So those things aren't often thought about. So I would say that preventative maintenance has a huge impact on your overall cost. And I think a lot of times that companies have run to failure in the thought process that that's actually lower cost, and it's not.
And David, I would chime in too that what is often overlooked is how bad it could be if you go to failure. So oftentimes we see our clients and companies that are trying to keep producing because they have so much demand they can't afford, they believe they can't shut down to properly maintain the equipment. But that oftentimes leads to some kind of catastrophic failure that's going to take way more time to repair in order to get the product back out to the customers. So at the end of it, the customer's impacted worse by waiting for that failure instead of planning correctly and communicating. So it's back to, now that you're the manufacturer, communicate with your customers, be transparent, and let them know that we're trying to avoid a catastrophic event so everybody can be aligned.
Yep, I think it's exactly right.
Yeah, keeping it as a baseline seems to be very important, because if it's overlooked, it can lead to so many other increased costs. In touching on the maintenance piece, though, and having your machines running properly, having them audited and checked on frequently and regularly, what are some of the other ways, David, that you've put into play and seen at companies to enforce or increase, workforce productivity without increasing things like headcount or overtime?
Well, I think that gets back to what we talked about before. I mean, you got to take waste out of the process. And waste comes in many forms, very often defined as 7 or 8 different forms. But, taking waste out of the process, that does not mean, people necessarily have to work harder, but you want them to be more effective and efficient. Those are two different things. So, taking waste out of the process, and one of those wastes, thinking about preventative maintenance, is a waste of waiting caused by downtime. So taking waste out of this process, be it in labor, in materials, in quality expectations and performance, those are all ways that you can improve the cost of delivering to your customer.
And could you also add process optimization in there, like and standardization? Is that along those lines?
Process optimization, standardization are ways that we do that. They are in some sense like Lean, like Six Sigma. They're the wrench and the screwdriver of how I create a more capable process and take waste out of it. So yes, they are. They're just hows, not whats.
Yeah, great to know. Brian, did you have some input there?
Yeah, I would agree. If you have robust processes to control your standards, that's key. Making sure you're just consistent the way that you attack and address problems and put in corrective actions.
And just finishing that thought, I think we talked about agility, supply chain agility, but also manufacturing agility is very, very important. So, if I have a more stable workforce, in other words, I've hired, I don't churn those folks, then I can cross-train my employees, and cross-train employees make us more agile, can do different things. We can juke around issues much easier with a cross-trained workforce, but it also engages those employees at a much higher level. So, an engaged workforce is going to be more effective in satisfying the customer and delivering lower cost as well. So I think all those things play in to the to solving the cost struggle that we have now created of late by tariffs.
Yeah, there's no one size fits all, it seems. But, David, say that an organization does have a great employee engagement. People are aware and capable of managing different lines and different responsibilities. How can leaders, would you say, further foster a culture of a continuous improvement to not just keep that as the baseline, but improve continuously going forward?
I think it starts with expecting that to happen. Having that as an expectation, there's always opportunity that I can go find, and then pushing that down into the organization. I did another podcast recently, and that was a question like, what are we going to do? Our costs are going up. So, well, you got to go find waste in the process and figure out how to improve it. And the comment was, well, wait a minute, we've done that for 20 years. It's already there. There can't be any more opportunity. Well, I would say, yes, it can. And the same thing I said on that podcast was, it's a journey, not a destination, right? You can always get better. As soon as you think you've arrived, you're backing up, right? People are passing you. So first, having that expectation, and then promulgating that expectation and idea there's opportunity for improvement throughout the organization, down to all levels of management, right down to the operators, because companies that are so engaged that the operators are giving their supervisors things to do, process improvements that need to be made, and then enacting on those things, those are companies that are going to, they're very engaged, but the very engagement is driving the process improvement.
Yeah, it seems with the engagement, you get a lot more feedback too. There's things like feedback loops that may not have been in play before, and leaders can lean on those as well.
Absolutely. The other key element, we talk about people, but our employees are a critical resource, right? We need to learn to listen to what they have to say. They're the ones at the front line doing the work. They're going to see where there's potential opportunities way faster than a supervisor or manager is going to be able to see that. So listen to what the employees are having to say, and most importantly, react to it. Make sure that they actually see that you're making improvements and listening to what they have to say.
It was a pleasure speaking with both of you, and we really want to focus on how manufacturers can stay lean while still hitting AOP goals, even on smaller budgets. Anything can lead to big results, and it's about taking those first couple of small steps before jumping into any conclusions. For more insights like these, we have a Manufacturing Edge episode come out monthly. It's on Spotify. And if you found this episode helpful, please like, share, post it on LinkedIn, leave us a review on Spotify. It means a lot. And we look forward to speaking with you next time. Keep pushing the manufacturing edge. David and Brian, thanks so much for hopping on and sharing your insights today.